thank you all for coming. My name is Jack Butler. Some of you may know me as John. Call me whatever you want. Welcome to the final event of the Gadfly group. As you probably know from our excellently designed posters, designed by the man who's taking photos. This is a debate on the legacy of Lincoln, who, 139 years ago last week was killed by John Wilkes Booth. So this is timely. But Lincoln is always timely. Of all the American presidents of all the presidents we've had, Lincoln's legacy is one that has stayed with us. But there's a debate over him. And that's why I'm so happy we have two very able men to represent both sides of that debate. We have Dr. Kevin Portteus of the Hillsdale Politics Department, who is great. He has a lot of things to his credit, but in the interest of time, I won't read them. And then we have Dr. Wenzel, who once taught here, now teaches at Florida Gulf Coast University, and he's also great. The way this debate is going to work, we're going to have 10 minutes of opening statements for each person. Response to opening statements, 5 minutes each. Then there will be a question and answer period involving you, the audience, and that will take 25 minutes. And I will choose whose questions I prefer. Then we will have final remarks from each participant, and whoever went first in the debate will go last in the final remarks. Before we begin, I'd just like to read the mission statement of the Gadfly group, because we're a group and we have a mission statement. The mission of the Gadfly group is to agitate Hillsdale College's regnant conservative ethos, which too often limits and even prevents true understanding of the appeal and arguments of modern liberalism. Through fair, civil, and challenging debates, lectures, and discussions, the group will provide Hillsdale students with a healthy dose of the thoughtful provocation that would have faced them regularly at many other higher education institutions. This intellectual stimulation will refine students' own views, allow them to leave campus with a deeper understanding of opposing ideologies, and ultimately enable them to contest such ideas both more reasonably and more effectively, both on and beyond Hillsdale's campus. Where's Joel? Joel, time for the coin flip. I do. Don't trust myself with the coin. Now, who would like heads and who would like tails?
Zach, will you verify that this coin is double-sided?
I'll take that.
Heads?
Heads.
All right.
Heads?
It is heads. Would you like to go first or second?
I'll go first.
All right. So we will begin with Dr. Wenzel's opening statement. You may begin.
Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here. I've never had this many people in a classroom listening to me at Hillsdale. I do have to start with almost an apology, because Hillsdale always welcomes me by following the dictates of Xenia and welcoming me as a foreigner and even as a member of the family. But you wanted a gadfly, and so here's a gadfly, and here I am casting some doubts on one of the saints in the Hillsdale pantheon. As a scholar, I am dedicated to pursuing truth and defending liberty. That would be a good motto for a college. So I'm going to try to do that and simply point out what I can about the historical and constitutional record. I'd like to start with a disclaimer. Although I will raise some questions about Lincoln's actions, I am not a Confederacy sympathizer. Slavery remains a stain on American history, and in the words of my colleague Dr. Charles Steele, who is here, he called it once the American Gulag, and I agree with him. I think in this debate, the debate that occurred in the 1860s, it was not easy because the South was wrong because of slavery, and the North was wrong for violating the Constitution. So I'm not here in an inflammatory spirit. Put away your stars and bars, put away your Bonnie Blue flags, and let's have a debate. I do have a hostage rescue team waiting outside, and in case any irate graduate students from the School of Statesmanship storm the stage, I have a copy of the Lyceum Address in here to storm them away. So, it's 1861. It's 1861. You are the President of the United States, and half a dozen states have seceded from the Union. What do you do as the Chief Executive Officer charged with enforcing the United States Constitution? This is going to be easy. You've all studied the Constitution. It's Hillsdale. But I do want to emphasize, the U.S. Constitution is a constitution of delegated and enumerated powers. So as a reminder, the Constitution does not say the federal government may do X unless X is forbidden by the Constitution, although the courts today would have us believe that. But the Constitution says the federal government may not do anything at all if it is not explicitly authorized by the Constitution. So what does the Constitution say about secession? Nothing. Secession is never mentioned. There is no prohibition on the states from seceding and no federal authority to prevent the states and not to prevent them by force. If there's any doubt on this, you can look at the 10th Amendment. What does the Constitution say? Well, Article 1, Section 8 does give Congress, not the President, Congress the power to call forth the militia to execute the laws of the Union, suppress insurrections, and repeal invasions. Article 1, Section 10 prohibits the states from entering into any treaty, alliance, or confederation, or enter into any agreement or compact with any other state. Article 4, Section 4 is the guarantee clause that guarantees to every state in this union a republican form of government. And Article 6 says that the constitutions and law are the supreme law of the land. All of those provisions apply to states only. So, if the Constitution does not forbid secession, and it does not, or if it does not empower the U.S. government to prevent secession by force or not by force, and it does not, then all of those clauses do not apply to the states that had left the Union because they were no longer states in the Union. They apply only to states that remain in the Union. We cannot assume as a premise precisely what we're trying to dispute here. So in conclusion, the U.S. Constitution grants no authority to the central government to prevent a state from leaving. I'm going to paraphrase Madison for a moment. He first said this with respect to the authorization of public funds for private purposes. I cannot undertake to lay my finger on that article of the Constitution which grants a power to the central government to prevent states from seceding. Lincoln's war was unconstitutional and amounted to an undeclared war against a foreign country. The organizers of the debate asked us to discuss federalism after we discussed the constitutional aspects. I think I've already touched upon federalism to a large extent, but I'm going to turn now instead to Lincoln's motivations for preventing the South from leaving the Union, a much more important question than why the South wanted to leave. Well, the conventional wisdom has it that the Civil War was fought about slavery, and that's true to an extent, but it's more complicated than that. For the South, slavery was indeed the principal cause. I'm not going to get up here and tell you, oh no, it was all about tariffs, slavery had nothing to do with it. Slavery was the principal cause, but tariffs were also an issue and states' rights were also an issue. For Lincoln and for the North, however, slavery was a secondary issue. First, a bit of economics. You're not going to get away with it. It's a nice Friday afternoon, but I'm going to have to teach you a little bit of economics here. Slavery overall was not an efficient system. Think about the efficiency of compelling labor versus allowing people to discover their own merits and their own comparative advantage in an economy. To wit, the Southern income was lower than the Northern income pre-1860, but higher in the specific sector of agriculture because slavery was profitable to a very small group of slave owners, but profitable only if the cost could be externalized. On whom? Well, first, on the slaves, obviously. Second, onto the poor whites who were compelled to serve on runaway slave patrols. And third, onto the northern states and ultimately the U.S. central government that were compelled to return slaves under the Fugitive Slave Clause of the Constitution, Article 4, Section 2, and the 1850 Fugitive Slave Law, which turned from state enforcement to federal enforcement. So, if emancipation had really been Lincoln's prime directive, that's a Star Trek reference, there were options better than war. Any option basically that raised the cost of slavery by facilitating the runaway of slaves could have ultimately led to the demise of slavery. Simply repeal the Fugitive Slave Clause in the Constitution and the 1850 Fugitive Slave Law, especially after the southern states had left the Congress. Lincoln could have allowed the Union states not to enforce that clause in that law. He could have pushed for emancipation in the border states, and if we want to be really radical about this, what would have led to the end of slavery? Northern secession. Because then slaves could have run away into the north, and then there would have been a domino effect, first into the border states, and then into the southern states. But emancipation was not Lincoln's primary motivation. I quote from an 1862 letter from Lincoln to the editor Horace Greeley. I quote, "My paramount object in this struggle is to save the Union, and is not to save or destroy slavery. If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that. What I do about slavery and the colored race, I do because I believe it helps to save the Union, and what I forbear because I do not believe it would help to save the Union," end quote. At the 1864 Hampton Roads Peace Conference between Lincoln and Confederate Vice President Stevens, Lincoln indicated that the South could prevent or postpone ratification of an anti-slavery amendment if it rejoined the Union. Lincoln, however, was inflexible on one condition. Reuniting the country was not negotiable. So finally, we were asked, what was Lincoln's legacy? I'd like to start with 5 categories of constitutional violation that started with Lincoln and haunt us to this very day. First of all, Lincoln's war effectively killed federalism. General Ulysses S. Grant, later a president, laid out his own theory of secession, and I quote, The right of a state to secede from the Union has been settled forever by the highest tribunal, arms, that men can resort to, end quote. Part of Lincoln's legacy was also federal and military interference with state elections and imprisonment of state legislators and other officials in border states who did not agree with his policies. Second violation, precedent. Lincoln usurped congressional powers, for example, by raising militias and declaring war. He ignored the Supreme Court over habeas corpus, and there's some debate on the history of this, but apparently went so far as to write standing orders for the arrest of Chief Justice Taney, which were never served. And he moved the Constitution from the original document of negative and enumerated powers to a document of assumed powers. The courts took about 70 years to catch up with Lincoln, but they eventually caught up in the post-Lochner, post-Wendell Holmes era. Number 3, civil liberties. Lincoln suspended habeas corpus, which I remind you under Article 1, Section 8 is a congressional power, not a presidential power. An estimated 14,000 political prisoners were imprisoned. The U.S. government started monitoring mail and telegraphs. The NSA wasn't invented yet, but they had the precursor to that, and engaged in postal censorship as well as gun confiscation in the non-seceding border states. Number 4, this is the beginning of big economic intervention. The first national income tax in history, subsidies to industry, and the National Currency Acts and Legal Tender Act, which paved the way for fiat money and national banking system as a precursor to the Federal Reserve. Number 5, big government and new agencies. Before the war, government spending was at 2% of GDP. After the war, 20%. The war also saw, as a result, compulsory public primary education extended to the South, a new comptroller of the currency and Secret Service for the federal government's new fiat money, a National Academy of Sciences so the government could interfere with the pursuit of truth, a Department of Education, which was rolled into the Department of Interior, and the first federal Department of Justice. In addition, during the war, people had become accustomed to government attempts at solving social problems. So we saw after the war new state police powers on public health, business regulation, professional licensing, anti-liquor and anti-vice laws, and bar associations. Furthermore, in sum, what is the conclusion? What is the legacy of Lincoln's war? Big central government, strong presidency, no state counterweights after the death of federalism, and a constitution that was ignored. The seeds of progressivism and big government were sown in soil plowed by Lincoln. In conclusion, Lincoln acted constitutionally. It's not clear that the war was necessary to end slavery, awful as it was, and Lincoln's legacy still haunts us today. So how should conservatives think about Lincoln's legacy? If by conservatism you mean limited government and respect for constitutional constraints, Lincoln's legacy is problematic. If by conservatism you mean a strong national government to forge a common purpose and for regime preservation, then yes, I could see how one can embrace Lincoln's legacy. As a philosophical libertarian and a professional constitutionalist, I am very troubled by Lincoln's unconstitutional war and its legacy of big government and the use of power over constitutional constraints. Thank you.
That was impressive. You were 3 seconds under. Dr. Portteus, you may begin.
I don't think I can talk that fast. Look, anytime you're talking about a person, so I'm the pro-Lincoln person. Anytime you're talking about a person, you have to be careful about turning it into some kind of sacred reference. Right? Lincoln was a human being, so I take a pro-Lincoln position, but at the same time acknowledging, look, for instance, his internal improvement scheme in Illinois in the 1830s was an utter disaster. It was a bad idea, it was poorly conceived, it was poorly executed. Right? What does that prove? Well, it proves that Abraham Lincoln is a human being and makes mistakes. Okay, that said, the appropriation of Lincoln by the American left and the image of Lincoln that we have as a result is, and I've said this in class and used this image, one of the great body-snatching expeditions in American history. Right? It's when conservatives and libertarians who tend to criticize Lincoln do so, what they're criticizing is an image concocted by the progressives at the beginning of the 20th century and not the actual person. Right? The progressives viewed Lincoln and interpreted Lincoln as a person who was utterly without principles. Right? Woodrow Wilson actually said about him, quote, he did not have any theories at all. Oh, okay. He also said that Lincoln saw America as something to be reborn and remade. Oh, okay. Well, that's also interesting. Theodore Roosevelt had a career-long obsession after his presidency with casting Lincoln as a progressive. Right? He went on and on in speech after speech about how There's no difference between the Republican Party of Lincoln's time and the Progressive Party of his own time. Right? The progressives are simply, to use the title of one of his speeches, the heirs of Abraham Lincoln. But again, I think that's a fiction. I don't think that's correct. The problem is we have uncritically accepted that, or at least large portions of the scholarly community have uncritically accepted that and disliked it. And if that was really what Lincoln was, I would dislike it too. There it is. Okay, so looking at some specific constitutional issues, general constitutional issues, and then the basic issue of who Lincoln was. Was he, quote unquote, a conservative? What is his legacy for conservatives? The biggest set of specific issues deals with the spring of 1861, the specific set of constitutional issues, when Lincoln undertook a number of actions between the fall of Fort Sumter and the convening of Congress, a space of slightly less than 3 months, April 15th through July 4th, 1861. Right? Some of these were specifically authorized by the Constitution. Now, you say, for instance, wait a minute, he waited until July 4th to call Congress into special session. Right? That means he wanted all this time for a free hand. Hold on. Congress was not scheduled to meet until December of 1861. He advanced the convening of Congress by 5 months. Congress only met for a few months a year in those days. Moreover, in April of 1861, 7 loyal states had still not held their congressional elections. States didn't do their elections for all these lower offices below president all on the same day the way we do them today. That is to say, there was no quorum. So if Congress had met, what would it have done? Well, nothing. Okay. A blockade. Well, look, a blockade is perfectly authorized under the laws of war. Right? A blockade is a perfectly legitimate military action in the event of a war. And military hostilities were initiated when the Confederates attacked Fort Sumter. They created a state of war. Right? Okay. Suspension of the writ of habeas corpus. We have to be very careful about the suspension of the writ of habeas corpus. It is in Article 1, dealing with Congress, but it is not in Article 1, Section 8, dealing with the powers of Congress. It is in Article 1, Section 9, dealing with those things which are specifically forbidden to Congress. All it says is that the privilege of the writ of habeas corpus shall not be suspended except when in cases of rebellion or invasion the public safety may require it. Notice that it's in the passive voice. Right? It never says who has that power. That's not clear. Right? It's in a list of powers that are specifically withheld from Congress. Okay, leaving that aside for general considerations. The two biggest issues were the spending of money and the calling of volunteers. Even the calling of militia is rendered less problematic by the fact that the president was authorized to do that under the still valid Militia Acts of 1792 and 1795. Right? But calling for 3-year volunteers was more problematic. Okay, so how do we explain this? Very simply, the war. Right? All of this has to be looked at in its appropriate context. Right? That is to say, there was a war, and not just a war, but the most terrible kind of wars, a massive armed insurrection, right? Which had claimed to form a government, which was forming an army, which had attacked a United States military installation. Right? All of these constitute acts of war. Right? And so we have this problem, and it's a problem that Madison and Hamilton recognized in the Federalist. Right? So in Federalist 20, in Federalist 23, in Federalist 25, both Hamilton and Madison make the point that, look, you cannot foresee in advance and define every contingency that may arise under the operation of the law, and yet you must still have the ability to deal with these problems. Right? How do you deal with a massive armed insurrection? Right? The Constitution does not expressly say, it doesn't tell you. Right? It just doesn't say. How do you, now, the interpretation of the Constitution that Madison and Hamilton advanced in those essays was this. We need to interpret the document so that officers under the Constitution have the power that they need to perform their functions consistent with the Constitution. Right? And not interpret it so narrowly that it cannot meet the exigencies that may arise in the future. Right? And so, in Lincoln's case, his oath of office and his obligation to take care that the laws be faithfully executed became paramount concerns. Okay, so going further, right? Lincoln never claimed exemption from responsibility for his actions. Right? He submitted all of the things he did in the spring of 1861 to Congress. Congress ratified all of them. Right? And so, okay, he also then insisted that the elections of 1862 and 1864 take place. Right? He said at the time of the 1864 election that if the rebellion should force us to forego or postpone an election, then the rebellion may already be said to have conquered and ruined us. Right? We cannot have free government without elections. Right? And so he insisted, even with the knowledge that he was going to take a beating in the midterms in 1862, and he did, even in the belief that he was going to lose the election of 1864. No, he didn't. Right? But for most of the summer and fall, he thought he was going to lose, and said so. Right? His own party tried to depose him after they nominated him. Right? He was convinced that he was going to lose. But the election has to go forward. Right? Finally, think about this. What could Lincoln have done? How far could he have gone, and what did he actually do? Right? The answer is not very much. Right? Okay. One more issue, since I'm down to 2 minutes. Secession. There is no such thing as secession under the Constitution. Right? You cannot make the argument for strict construction of the Constitution and then find secession somewhere, magically, which, of course, isn't stated. Right? What the Constitution does is to move us away from the interpretation of the federal government that places the states in a position of supremacy vis-a-vis the federal government. That, Seward noted as early as 1850, is simply a return to the Articles of Confederation. The Constitution divides sovereignty. Right? Each part of government, state and federal, is sovereign within its own sphere. Right? Each derives its power directly from the people. Right? The federal government does not obtain its power from the states. That's the Articles of Confederation. Right? It obtains its power from the people of that state. So the authority of each stands on the same basis. Right? Okay, so what does that mean? Right? What that means is, look, what you have in the case of secession then, as Lincoln puts it in the first inaugural, is either insurrection or revolution. But revolution may only be exercised in pursuit or defense of inherent natural rights. And there can be no natural right to hold another human being as chattel property. So what you have is an armed insurrection against lawfully constituted government. We could go on and talk about the differences between the progressives and Lincoln. Lincoln believed in natural law. He believed in inherent rights, in government by consent as opposed to the modern administrative state, the permanency of human nature. Okay, you get the idea. Right? And so we can discuss those at greater length as needed going forward.
You guys are really on the ball. All right. Dr. Wenzel, you now have 5 minutes to respond to Dr. Portteus' opening statement. You may begin.
Thank you. This is probably not the time to confess that we've been practicing for 3 weeks over Skype so that we could have the time because we didn't. First of all, so I want to address, I think we have a disagreement over constitutional interpretation here. There's no such thing as secession under the Constitution. I agree. There is no such thing as secession under the Constitution. Because the Constitution is silent on it, we cannot invent a federal power to prevent secession. So the whole point with the Constitution is that it is a constitution of delegated and enumerated powers. We could, and we're on the cusp of this, getting lost in theory. I understand basically what my colleague is making is the so-called union or perpetual efficacy theory of constitutional interpretation, indicating that the states gave up certain power to the federal government, and therefore that the federal government had its own powers in its sphere and the states in other. The contrary theory to that, of course, is the compact theory where the states come together. We could talk about that. I would simply point out that it was state conventions that ratified the U.S. Constitution and not the people directly under Article 7 of the Constitution. I would mention that the Constitution, which I have here, mentions state prerogatives more than 70 times. So clearly the states did not completely give up their sovereignty, and the fact that we the people was in the preamble of the Constitution was an accident of history. It was supposed to be we the people of New York, Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, etc., but the constitutionalists were not sure which states would actually sign on, so it would have been rather embarrassing to have a massive typo in the days before printing. So I, however, am always leery of that kind of constitutional interpretation because we can read anything we want into the text. Start reading a power of the federal government to prevent secession. Why not read a power of the federal government to, say, mandate that people buy health insurance? Oh wait, the court already did that. So rather than getting lost in theory, I would answer that I agree with the Federalist Papers. The constitutions cannot foresee all problems, but that is why exactly it binds the hands from mischief of those who hold power. So for example, the Constitution does not say things like the Congress may not do this and the president may not do that unless Congress is in recess. No, there's no such provision. Congress has its hands tied, the president has its hands tied. So if we look directly at the language of the Constitution, we can't just start saying things, well, unless the Congress doesn't do this or unless the president doesn't act, because that starts to be the type of dangerous constitutional interpretation that President Obama is engaging in right now with, well, if the Congress won't act, then I'll bypass the Congress with executive orders. Not in the Constitution either. So my point in all of this is we need to look at the text of the Constitution and the mechanisms that the framers specifically use to bind the hands of those in power, rather than looking at some other things, penumbras and emanations of powers, perhaps, that may be in there. I agree also that we are looking at Lincoln's actions and not Lincoln the person. I have intentionally eschewed quoting too much from Lincoln. I would rather look at his actions rather than his talk. He was, after all, a politician, trying to garner votes, trying to work with different elements in the elections that he had, trying to hold together a very difficult to hold together coalition. So of course he was going to say some contradictory things. And on the matter of internal improvements that they failed in Illinois, I don't think internal improvements are a matter of prudence and a matter of working out. They're a matter of principle. Does the federal government have the power to do them? Does it not? That is the fundamental question that we're asking here. And then finally, I would say, I'm not entirely sure where we stand on this business of insurrection versus war. The southern states had left. They had seceded. They were now a foreign country. And it's not clear to me that the Congress actually declared war. Well, the Crittenden-Johnson congressional resolution did come close to it. And in an irony of history, the resolution read that the U.S. was not waging a war, quote, in any spirit of oppression, nor for any purpose of conquest or subjugation, nor purpose of overthrowing or interfering with the rights or established institutions of those states, but only, quote, to defend and maintain the supremacy of the Constitution and to preserve the Union. Not exactly what happened. So in closing, I would say we need to be extremely careful about what the Constitution specifically authorizes, because the Constitution is a document of delegated and enumerated powers. As soon as we start assuming powers, which is exactly what Lincoln did, we're in a world of trouble, and the Constitution ceases to be to bind men down from mischief. To quote from Jefferson or Madison, and I'm drawing a blank right now, but I'll yield the rest of my time.
All right. Dr. Portteus, you have 5 minutes to respond.
I suppose the best place to start is with the idea of whether or not something is explicitly authorized by the Constitution. This is another instance of transformation that takes place between the Articles of Confederation and the Constitution. Article 2 of the Articles of Confederation says that the federal government may only exercise those powers which are expressly delegated to it by that instrument. Right? Fast forward to the Constitution, doesn't resolve the issue at all, but the 10th Amendment does. Right? And that language expressly delegated disappears. Right? Otherwise, the 10th Amendment is almost an exact replica of Article 2 of the Articles of Confederation, except for that expressly delegated. Right? Now, I'm the last person to argue that the necessary and proper clause has no bounds. Right? And I think that one of the great miscarriages of legal history is to ignore the word proper in there, right? Which has definite meaning. But be that as it may, right? The idea that it has to be explicitly authorized in the text simply doesn't translate into the Constitution, right? That is to say, there is some room for that great boogeyman, implied powers. Right? They do exist, right? At any rate, on other issues, the problem of prerogative power is a universal one. Right? Locke talks about it in the second treatise with regard to what we presume is going to be monarchy. But right, all governments have to find ways to deal with these exigencies and survive. Right? The problem, I think, with Dr. Wenzel's interpretation, and this is not guilt by association, you find it in the final annual message of President James Buchanan. He says, there's no right to secede on the part of the states, and there's no power on the part of the federal government, right, to do anything about it. In other words, right, you have something of a legal absurdity, which is to say, there is a wrong for which there is no redress under the law. That's a problem, right? And that seems to me to be a problematic interpretation of the Constitution. It is also correct that conventions were used to ratify the Constitution rather than the people directly. But we shouldn't look at it in terms of the difference between conventions and plebiscite, because plebiscite was never considered seriously by anybody, and given the realities of 18th century governance, right, not considered seriously by anybody as a means of ratifying the Constitution. The other alternative was ratification by state legislatures. This is the method that was pursued in the ratification of the Articles of Confederation. Right? In Vices of the Political System in the United States, Madison very specifically says this is one of the great defects of the Articles of Confederation, because right, the state governments then have a claim to supremacy over the federal government. And so ratification by convention will fix that. You can no longer have the claim of state supremacy. It's an opinion he held to the end of his life. Madison was actually involved in the nullification controversy. He was still alive and was still involved in politics at the age of 80. Right? Just that year, he sat in Massachusetts, Virginia's Constitutional Convention, and played an active part. Right? And he reiterated in 1830 exactly what he had said in 1787, which is that the power of the federal government flows to flows not from the states, but from the people in each state, acting independently of their state governments. Moreover, the states did not concede power to the federal government in the Constitution. The people withdrew power from the states and gave it to the federal government. Right? The states did not assign that power. Lincoln's internal improvement scheme in the Constitution, there are absolutely no federal constitutional issues involved because it was conceived and executed entirely at the state level. It was an Illinois project and an Illinois project only. There are no constitutional issues with that in particular. The question of whether or not a war exists. This is addressed in an 1863 case, which you read if you're in my presidency course, the prize cases. Right? The schooner Crenshaw, the bark Hiawatha, the brig Amy War. Anyway, those are the ships involved, right? The technical name of the case. And the point is, right, that if you say that you can't use the powers incident to a state of war because it's an insurrection, then you've created a sort of self-fulfilling loop that prevents the government from preserving itself. Every government is intended to be perpetual. Right? So you cannot say, okay, here's a government, but they have no right to secure their own existence. Right? Continue to obey the law, and any government will last indefinitely. Okay, I think I'm about out of time, so I better leave off with that, and we'll have time for question and answer.
Man, you guys.
We're good like that.
Yeah. All right, so now we're going to open it up to the audience. For 25 minutes, there will be... question and answer from the audience. Each participant will answer questions directed to both or otherwise generally asked, and the other participant will also have the chance to respond to questions asked only of one. So we'll begin in the back and to the left. Yes.
This question is both. How much more difficult is it to respond to modern progressive ideology, theory, and practice without resolving this question of human rights?
I'm happy to go first if you don't. I think it's terribly important because the basic question, right? Lincoln understood this. He says in the last debate, right? And this is another instance where you can see Lincoln's not really a progressive. He doesn't believe in progress. He says, look, this is the same question of right and wrong that has dogged man from the beginning of man and will continue to do so right up into the end. Right? The basic question of this basic fundamental issue, argument. Right? The big issue, or I think the big problem, the departure point that you get in the progressive era is, right, rights cease to be inherent, inalienable, and natural. Right? They cease to come from God and now come from man. There's only two places where your rights can come from. Right? If they don't come from God, they must come from man. So even if you follow the oldest and most ancient tradition back all the way to its roots, you either end up with some person who implements it consciously or unconsciously, or some claim to divine sanction. But if it's a claim to divine sanction, then it's no longer good because it's old, it's good because it's good simply. Right? And if it's good because it's old, well, yes, many things that are old are good. And many things that are old are very bad. Right? My favorite example in class is the Aztec religion. Very old and venerated. Anybody want to partake? I call the role of priest. No communicants? No? Okay.
I know it's boring for a gadfly debate, but on the philosophical part, I largely agree. Natural rights versus rights coming from government. But I think the important question in response to your, the important answer in response to your question is, yes, of course, it's a very, very important question, because if we look at government today, the same questions that we have today were the same questions that were taking place under Lincoln. What are the limits of federal power? Lincoln effectively ended federalism as a check against the central government. He weakened the checks and balances of the multiple branches, something with which we are still by which we're still haunted today. And finally, still this question, not to beat a dead horse to death again, implied powers versus delegated powers. Those are fundamental questions that Lincoln answered in his own way. I think the Constitution has a different I think the Constitution has a different take on that, but the problems, the very same questions on the limits of power that were asked in 1861 are the types of questions that we're asking today. Now, the big difference is you, some of us, might like some of the things that Lincoln did and might not like some of the things that progressives are doing. Progressives might like some of the things for which they're using government and have disliked some of the things for which Lincoln are doing. But as a constitutionalist, my concern is always, what does the Constitution authorize? Not do we like what the Constitution is doing, and do we like the effects of the violation of the Constitution?
Josiah.
Dr. Wenzel, my question is for you. You mentioned that there is no explicit mention of secession within the Constitution, and therefore, in your way of interpreting the document, you say that this allows the states to secede whenever they have the desire to do so. My question for you is, the Constitution makes no mention that individuals are restricted from secession. So why then, and where do you find that document, a principle that would allow governments like the states to prevent citizens from arbitrarily deciding that they would no longer follow the laws? I was curious how you would respond to that.
Well, there's a difference between not following the laws and seceding. When you're seceding as a state, you're setting up your own state and setting up your own laws instead of the earlier powers that you had, as opposed to the individual disappearing. That's a very good question. I think part of that comes from the American tradition, and I'm going to go compact theory on you here. I apologize for that. It was the states indeed that compacted to form the Constitution. However, counties, for example, and this is one of the great critiques of Calhoun, for example. I'm not a Calhoun scholar. I'm not a fan of Calhoun. I just want to say, I don't want people walking away saying Wenzel's a big fan of Calhoun and argues in favor of slavery. We're going to be careful about that, because Calhoun argued for nullification, and one of the big arguments against Calhoun was the reductio ad absurdum. If you can have a state nullify a federal power, why not have a county nullify a state power? Why not have an individual, etc.? Well, there are two answers to that, I think. First of all, the states compacted to form the Constitution, whereas the counties are administrative units of the states. So there's a big difference there. The second thing that we have is a question, going back to Locke again here. In many ways, I would say that the Constitution is a conservative document in the sense that it does not allow for willy-nilly departure. It specifically has language about rebellion. It specifically has language about insurrection. But there's a difference between rebellion, insurrection, and anarchy on the one hand, and a state voting to break the bonds from another state and moving on in the other direction. And by other direction, I mean its own state. Sorry. One gets carried away sometimes.
Dr. Portteus, do you have any response to that?
All of that's fine, assuming that there's any such thing as secession in the Constitution. I think that gets us back to, not to beat the dead horse, but that gets us back to the basic issue, right? And I don't think it works to simply transplant the compact theory that's present in the Articles of Confederation into the Constitution, right? Every attribute of external sovereignty is deprived from the states explicitly by the Constitution. Right? That is to say, states do have sovereignty, but they have sovereignty only within the Union. Right? As far as the rest of the world goes, they don't mean anything. Right? Only the federal government has exterior sovereignty. Right? So the states have sovereignty within the Union. right? And they do have it, and it is meaningful sovereignty. Right? Otherwise, you wouldn't have divided sovereignty. And we all agree, well, we all agree, I'll presume that we all agree that the federal government has transgressed that line in the 20th century. I don't think that Lincoln forms a viable precedent for that. Right? The expansions of the state, and I was just reading about this today actually, I saw a very helpful piece on this issue. The expansion in federal spending, the expansion in bureaucracy, the National Currency Act, right, the Internal Revenue Act, all of these were temporary measures to meet a temporary need, and they went away after the war. Right? Federal government shrank, right? And taking into account inflation and the growth in the population, spending returned basically to its pre-war levels. The federal bureaucracy returned to its pre-war levels. There's only 2 agencies that had any real growth during the war, right? Any marked growth. That is the Freedmen's Bureau, which disappeared in 1872, and the Pension Office. Well, no kidding. You've got hundreds of thousands of veterans, right, who are, under the law, entitled to a pension, right? So that has to be dealt with, right? But by any rational measure, right, and everybody saw this at the time that these were temporary measures. They were temporary measures designed to meet a temporary exigency. They were not meant to engineer a society. They were not meant to achieve a social agenda. They were meant to win a war, and that's it. Right? And when the war was done, we went back to the business of reducing the size of government. Did bureaucracy increase in the latter part of the 19th century? Sure it did. But on the one hand, Lincoln was dead. There's that. On the other hand, the growth of the bureaucracy did not happen at a much faster pace than the growth of the white-collar jobs in the private sector generally.
Dr. Steele?
Really quick question for both of you. Maybe I'm wrong, but my understanding is that nothing happened. The Southern states seceded, nothing happened until South Carolina attacked Fort Sumter. Isn't that right? So actually, it's the things that you're charging. I'll give it to you first. The things that you're charging Lincoln with only begin when he's in fact responding to a military attack.
Depends how you see it. Fort Sumter was a foreign military presence on South Carolina territory. So yes, South Carolina.
It was federal territory.
Well, after secession, it was no longer part of the federal government, and South Carolina had the prerogative to ask the federal garrison to leave, which it did not do. Lincoln then engaged in an act of war, and he was pretty crafty, I would say, about it in terms of resupplying the fort in, I think it was food and provisions, but not in military measures to try to provoke South Carolina into an attack. But at that point, it was a foreign military presence on South Carolina territory. So it's not entirely clear really who fired, I mean, it's clear who fired the first shot, but it's not entirely clear who was responsible in that case.
Well, again, assuming there's such a thing as secession in the Constitution, assuming that the theory of the Articles of Confederation is the same as the theory of the Constitution. I honestly don't know any other way to approach it other than that, right? And so I'll continue to approach it in that way. Was Lincoln crafty? Of course he was. He was a politician. Right? That's part of the game. And by the way, this is something I try to press with my students. He was a really good one, right? Which is to say, he understood how people worked. He understood how to make these different groups work together, how to balance them against one another. He understood how to deal with people, right? He had a very strong grasp of human nature. I don't think that's a particular knock against him to say that he was crafty, right? Or clever or anything else. But so we're down to the fundamental impasse, and that is Calhoun's theory of the Constitution the correct one? Or is Madison's theory of the Constitution the correct one, right? Which I think Lincoln adopted, right? Which is to say that on these other issues, whatever, we'll deal with that, but on this issue, the big issue, right? There's no such thing as secession. And one more thing, as far as the power to put down insurrections, that power clearly inheres in the federal government. So whether it was Lincoln on April 15th or Congress on July 4th, that was happening. Federal government, Article 4, Section 4, does have power to preserve a republican form of government, which, of course, thanks to the institution of slavery, those states did not have. Right? And it obligates the president to take care that the laws be faithfully executed. Now, his first inaugural address, in an attempt to keep the peace, he actually said, you know what, we're going to back off on that in an attempt to keep the peace, temporarily. Right? But then, of course, once a state of war exists, then all bets are off.
Back, left door.
For Dr. Wenzel, what is the purpose of the national government or any governments if a state or faction can just vote itself out of that government and start its own? Why have a bigger overarching one?
So I think there are two questions contained in that. What is the purpose of government? And what is the purpose of government if a state can leave?
It seems to kind of nullify the national government's power if a state can just leave it whenever it doesn't like what's going on.
Well, there are many purposes for government. Historically, the traditional one has been extraction of resources. But a bunch of fellows in 1776 got together and said, wait a minute. Historically, government has been about extracting resources. This is the roving bandit model. So a bunch of fellows get together in 1776 and say, well, wait a minute. Maybe there's some other way to organize government, like to secure these rights. Governments are instituted among men. That was the purpose of the U.S. government. That was the purpose of the U.S. Constitution. If you look at the Constitution as the implementation of the Declaration of Independence. So there are multiple answers to that. And if you look around the world, you're going to see multiple answers to what the purpose of government is. The second thing is, again, there's mention in here of, the Declaration of Independence, of the circumstances in which people leave, if people are unhappy, if a body politic no longer wants to be part of another body politic. We've had this question of perpetuity. So Article 2 of the Articles of Confederation said that each state retains its sovereignty. The Articles mentioned the concept of perpetuity 5 times. So the Articles of Confederation were supposed to be perpetual. Of course, they only lasted about a decade or so. But that question of perpetuity does not figure in the Constitution of 1787. In many ways, the Constitution of 1787 reflects the language, reflects the spirit of the Articles of Confederation. It's radically different in some ways, but it reflects it in many other ways. I don't think it's an accident. The founders could have put the question of perpetuity in there in the Constitution of 1787, but it's simply not there. So I really don't see a difficulty with states. The world is an organic process. There are occasions where states decide that they no longer want to be part of the same state. There are break-offs. The southern states voted to secede from the north. That was that.
I would suggest one thing, and that is, you may be right about the count on perpetuity. I know that the first instance of that is in the title, the Articles of Confederation and Perpetual Union between the States. Now, fast forward to the beginning of the Constitution, where it says that the Constitution exists to do half a dozen things, but one of them is to form what? Well, a more perfect union. More is a comparative. It has to have reference to something in order to have meaning. Well, more perfect than the Articles of Confederation is the rational inference, and that's the inference that Lincoln makes in the first inaugural address, which is that more perfect than what? Well, more perfect than the Articles of Confederation. But if it loses the element of perpetuity, then how is it more perfect? It would seem to me at that point, and it seemed to Lincoln in 1861, to be less perfect than the Articles of Confederation, if it lost this vital element that is inherent in nationhood. Because once you lose that element of perpetuity, now you no longer have a nation, you have an alliance. Right? You no longer have a regime in the classical sense. Right? You have a treaty of mutual defense and commercial advantage. And if you read documents like the Mississippi Resolutions on Secession, that's exactly how they refer to the Constitution. It exists for the economic and security benefit of the people of the various states. And that's it, nothing else.
Back, blue shirt.
How far do you ride the explicitly delegated powers clause? Because in Article 1, Section 8, it says we have an army that's part-time, we have a navy that's full-time. Now we have an air force. And I think it's easy to assume that an air force is akin to a navy in that it has ships and airplanes and it has to perpetually exist, whereas an army has men who can go home and farm. So, I mean, would you agree that we should have an Air Force, or would you say we need an amendment to get an Air Force?
Army, Air Force. Air Force is an administrative distinction. I don't have a problem with that.
I like it. That's all right.
That was easy. Thank you.
Yes, back. Yes.
So, Dr. Portteus, when rejecting, I think it was Buchanan's interpretation, or on the basis of legal absurdity, what's the basis for rejecting things on that basis? I mean, if I could play gadfly, the Constitution wasn't divinely inspired. why couldn't we just say it has an absurdity and therefore we need an amendment to resolve this rather than rejecting a given interpretation on that basis?
So in other words, the Constitution is so fatally flawed at the outset that it's as soon as somebody pushes on it, it's going to fall over.
Well, it had the reference for slaves in there, so we already know it had some type of laws.
Okay, all right. Hold on. What is the purpose of the thing? Okay. So, are we going to interpret that the original intention wasn't to fulfill its basic purpose? Does that make sense? Right? That somehow that they now look, they can make that mistake. That's a possibility, right? Madison and Hamilton said we didn't make that mistake. Right? We created a document that's going to be able to do this, and there are specific powers that allow the federal government to put down insurrections. Right? Those provisions exist. Right? There are, and at least, well, there are 2 occasions that I can think of where insurrections are specifically mentioned and means authorized under the Constitution to put them down. Right? So they're there. Right? So it's not a question of whether or not the power exists. The power exists. Right? Or a question of, well, what do we do since this power doesn't exist? Right? That's not, in the case of the Constitution, I don't think that's a meaningful question because the power is there. Right? And that's the point of those clauses in the Constitution.
I'd like to add to that briefly. I think that the founders, I'm a huge fan of the U.S. Constitution 1787, imperfect though it may be, but the founders did not talk about forming a perfect union. They talked about forming a more perfect union and foresaw the possibility that things could change. Article 5, there's an amendment process in which, by the way, the states and not just the people were involved, parenthetically. To add to that question, I think Buchanan was wrong. There is no contradiction within the Constitution because on this point, and we're going to start circling around each other at some point, but I wholeheartedly agree with you. Secession is not in the Constitution. Therefore, the federal government does not have the power to prevent it. Had there been something about, had the founders wanted to prevent that, they would have put language akin to the following in it in the Constitution, but the Constitution would never have been signed. Imagine in an 11th Amendment, Section 1, notwithstanding the guarantee clause in the 9th and 10th Amendments, no state may ever secede from the Union for any reason except by amendment pursuant to Article 5. Section 2, if any state attempts to secede without authorization, the federal government shall invade such state with sufficient military force to suppress the attempted secession. Section 3, the federal government may require the militias of all the states to join in the use of force against the seceding state. Section 4, after suppressing said secession, say that 3 times fast, the federal government shall rule said state by martial law until such time as said state shall accept permanent federal supremacy and alter its constitution to forbid future secessions. Section 5, after suppressing said secession, the federal government shall force said state to ratify a constitutional amendment which gives the federal government the right to police the states whenever it believes those states are violating the rights of their citizens. Section 6, the president may of his own authority suspend the operation of the Bill of Rights and the writ of habeas corpus in a seceding or loyal state, if in his sole judgment such is necessary to preserve the Union. Had the founders envisioned this, they would have put such an amendment in there. They were no slouches. They would have planned for something like that. However, had there been such language in it, the Constitution simply would not have been ratified by the states, which would have been terrified to have such language in it, with good reason.
2 quick points.
I didn't write that, by the way.
2 quick points. First, they didn't have to do that. There's already a power to suppress insurrections. Secondly, yes, I agree, there is an amendment process, and Lincoln points this out. He says, if you want to change the status quo, there are 2 ways out. There's the amendment process, which is the constitutional way out, and the only constitutional way out, and there's revolution. But the South really didn't want to bump up against the revolution thing. Why? Because revolutions are to protect natural rights. Why are they seceding? What right is it that they want to protect? Well, the right to hold other human beings as chattel property. Right? So if you want to change things, amendment or revolution, those are your options.
Skylar.
Whoa.
How do you define insurrection, and then how is that relevant to what took place? Because as Dr. Steele pointed out, it seems like the states who seceded didn't do anything until Fort Sumter incident. And insurrection to me seems to be an attack upon the existing government. So,
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think that's pretty straightforward. There was an armed attack on the federal government. Right. I define insurrection as taking up arms against lawfully constituted authority. Right. That is to say, what happened? Well, there was an election. Lincoln won the election. What did he do in the aftermath of the election that in and of itself would justify revolution? Nothing. Right? Whose rights had been violated at the time the seven deep South states, 6 deep South states plus Texas, seceded, rebelled? Nothing. And by the way, Sam Houston pointed this out in his role as governor of Texas. He said, this was in a letter in November of 1860, that if they do something, I'll be the first to fight. But they haven't done anything yet. Right? So what are we doing?
Dr. Wenzel?
I would simply reiterate what I've said before. At that point, it was no longer an insurrection against the federal government. It was simply a foreign country attacking a foreign country, 2 foreign countries fighting. It was a war.
All right, this will be our last question, most likely. Evan.
Regardless of the founders' intentions in writing the Constitution, which of these two constitute a constitutional interpretations is more in accordance with natural law, specifically the portion of natural law that indicates that consent of the governed is central to the justifiability of any state?
I don't think natural law, I'm sorry, I'm jumping the gun here. I don't think natural law provides a ready solution, right? That is to say, both of these theories are plausible under the doctrine of consent. Right? So that either one of them, so it becomes a question of, at this point, of which one of them is more effective at securing people's rights. Right? The Articles of Confederation proved to be disastrously incompetent to that end. Right? It couldn't prevent insurrections, like Shays' Rebellion. It couldn't stop the majorities in the states from tyrannizing over their own citizens. Right? It couldn't prevent the British from occupying U.S. sovereign territory on the frontier. There's a whole catalog of these things in Federalist 15. Right? It couldn't do these basic things that a sovereign nation has to do in order to secure the rights of its citizens. So at this point, it becomes a kind of grand policy disagreement. Which one of these is going to be better able to do? And that was the basic dispute between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists since 87 and 88. It wasn't a question of different principles. It was a question of which one of these different systems is going to do the thing that we all agree needs to be done.
I largely agree with that. I don't think either approach necessarily has to do with natural law. The best protection of natural law is in limited and enumerated powers, and the Founding Fathers knew that. There's no doubt that slavery was immoral. The South was on very, very weak moral ground in terms of leaving, but it left. It was no longer a part of the Union. So then the question in terms of our purposes, because we're talking about Lincoln, we're talking about the U.S. Constitution, not the Confederacy. If this were a debate about the morality of the Confederacy, I'd be the first to step up here and say it was immoral because it was based on slavery. However, the question is in terms of once the South had left, that's the first question. Why did the South leave? Okay, that's pretty clear. The more interesting question and the more relevant question for us tonight is why did the North not let it leave? So the question then is whether the Constitution authorizes the Union, whether the Constitution authorizes the President to invade a foreign country to stop an evil. I don't think it does.
All right, that ends our question and answer period. Now there will be, each participant will have no more than 2.5 minutes for final statements. And Dr. Wenzel, you began, so you will go last. So Dr. Portteus, you may begin.
Ominous beak. I did one of these things once for the college. I traveled, and they actually had on the podium the red, yellow, green light deal like they have at the Supreme Court. And so it literally started flashing red when I ran out of I got to stop. At any rate, a couple of things. One, the compact theory argument. I just want to say one quick thing about that. Right? So in the absence of anything in the Constitution allowing for secession, and in the face of the provisions of the Constitution that take sovereignty away from the states, deprive them of their external sovereignty, right? And in light of the idea of divided sovereignty, right? If you're going to assume a kind of compact or contract between the states at a bare minimum, like any other contract you might enter into in your private life, altering the nature of that contractual relationship requires unanimous agreement on the part of all parties. right? You can't go to the bank. Well, I can't go to the bank. I can't go to the bank and say, you know what? I don't feel like paying my house payment anymore.
Keep going. It's different.
I don't feel like paying my house payment. I thought that was the shot caller telling me this. I can't go tell them I'm just not going to pay my house payment anymore, but I'm going to continue to live there. Now, if I want to go and renegotiate the contract and they agree to that, that's different. Right? But secession was unilateral action. Second, something that got passed over was the economics of slavery. So I'm going to play amateur economist for a moment. Was slavery an inefficient institution? Slaveholders argued both ways, but the truth is, that's really irrelevant. Slavery was not primarily an economic institution. Slavery was a social institution. Right? So on the one hand, would slave labor economically have survived? Well, why not? Any labor that human beings can do, they can be made to do as slaves. The Soviets did nuclear physics by gulag labor. Right? There's no reason why they couldn't have threshed wheat in Kansas or dug for silver in Nevada. Right? On the other hand, slavery was a social institution. It produced a particular kind of society, and it warped people's judgment. If you read writings by defenders of slavery, what you find is that they didn't care about the economics of it. It produced a kind of society, a social order that they liked and wanted to promote, and they were attached to it. And it was a social order, by the way, that allowed them to replace God. When you own slaves, you replace God with yourself. Because the people you hold as slaves have to have you as their absolute Lord and Master in all cases whatsoever.
All right. Time has expired. Dr. Wenzel, you may begin.
Thank you. On the advice of counsel, I'm going to ask for the same extension. Just kidding. I think the compact theory is secondary. I think the compact theory is interesting. It's a question of interpretation. But fundamentally, the question is, the Constitution is a document of limited, delegated, enumerated powers. And if we start inventing things that are not in the Constitution, we get in big trouble. At least tonight, we agree on one point. Secession is not in the Constitution. However, my conclusion on that is that because secession is not in the Constitution, the federal government had no power to prevent the southern states from leaving. We have a different conclusion on that issue. The second question then is a parallel between ending slavery, the question of ending slavery versus maintaining the Union. Ending the slavery was a laudable goal. Slavery was an evil, but the question is, do you end slavery by invading a foreign country and by suspending the Constitution, or are there other means that could have been used, such as the ones that I pointed out in my opening statement? But the second question then is, I don't think slavery was one of the primary purposes of the North. The primary purpose was maintaining the Union. Now, perhaps it was maintaining the Union for power in a public choice story. I'm not going to make that claim. Perhaps it was maintaining the Union because the Union was the most effective vehicle to prevent slavery, but then it seems rather ironic to suspend the Constitution, to destroy federalism, and to destroy the guarantees of the Constitution and of separation of powers in order to preserve the Union. Lincoln wrote, and I quote, "Must a government of necessity be too strong for the liberties of its own people or too weak to maintain its own existence? In making the choice not to have a state that was too weak to maintain its own existence, Lincoln chose a state that was too strong for the liberties of its own people." Lincoln wrote, and my esteemed colleague could tell us exactly where this speech came from. I read it on the plane this afternoon. Lincoln wrote of the principles of the Declaration of Independence as an apple of gold in a picture of silver, the picture being a combination of the Constitution and the Union. Unfortunately, in the end, Lincoln smashed the apple and half the picture, the Constitution, in order to preserve the other half, which was the Union. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you all for coming. I'm sure these two could keep going at it for hours, but...
My wife would not be amused.
So, for the sake of Dr. Portteus' wife, this event is now over.
And if I may, let us raise a pint to which the wise and the honest can repair.